Hey, it's Miss Bell again. So this section is going to be on sexual and asexual reproduction. So if you take a look here, we have a picture of the different stages of meiosis, or you could call it meiosis, because this is how you produce sperm and egg, which eventually produces me, or a new human. So anyway, we begin with one cell, and we end with 4 cells. If you can see the 4 cells there. So this is a process of meiosis, which is a type of sexual reproduction. So again, there's 2 types of reproduction, sexual and asexual. If you take a look at this picture over here, you'll notice that you have only blue cells. Okay, so if you look in the center, you can see that the DNA is going to double and then split into 2 new cells. And then those 2 new cells begin the process over again. Very simple. Over here, you have a green and a blue parent. And the green and the blue parent then doubles their DNA. And then eventually comes together. So this would be the DNA doubling. It eventually comes together. And they swapped DNA here. And then you get your new cells. So in asexual reproduction, this is the production of offspring from one parent, and it does not involve gametes. Remember, gametes are your sex cells. So it does not involve gametes coming together, sperm and egg coming together. The cells do not join. Okay, all of the offspring are considered clones. So they are genetically identical, which is a clone of the parent. So the DNA is exactly the same. Anyway, a clone, like I said, is going to be produced in asexual reproduction. Now, mitotic cell divisions are going to be asexual. We've already been over mitosis. And so mitosis, because you take one diploid cell and make 2 diploid cells that are identical to the parent, mitosis is considered asexual. There are some other methods of asexual reproduction. We also mentioned binary fission. Binary fission is how bacteria reproduce, but also some protists, fungi, and even plants might reproduce through binary fission. Budding, vegetative propagation, and spore formation. And we're going to talk about each of those. Anyway, those are the different ways that different organisms might go through asexual reproduction. So, the advantage of specifically bacteria reproducing by binary fission is that it's very fast and it produces a large number of new cells. Because bacteria are very simple and all that's inside of them is cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes pretty much, the bacteria can double their DNA and split into 2 new cells pretty quickly. So E. coli is a common type of bacteria, and it can produce 1 million cells in 7 hours. So anyway, an advantage of asexual reproduction is that you can make many offspring very quickly. So this is binary fission in an amoeba. If you look here, we have our parent with the DNA, and then it doubles the DNA, and then it splits into, this is the splitting, step 1, step 2, step 3. Anyway, so that DNA splits into 2 new cells. So this is very simple. And amoebas are protists. They are eukaryotic, so they do have a nucleus. Binary fission in bacteria is going to be simpler because all that's going to happen is the bacteria duplicates its DNA and then it it splits into 2 new cells. Budding is something that fungi are known to do, but some other things do that too. Some animals do budding. So budding is considered asexual as well. Budding is basically where you have a little piece breaks off. If you look at the picture here, you have your blue DNA, and that blue DNA goes into this new piece. So you got your original piece and you got a new piece. So a smaller piece branches off and pinches or buds off with DNA in it, and it develops into a new organism. You can also see actual pictures of budding occurring in these pictures here. Lots of budding. Okay, so some things that bud would be yeast. Yeast is a very common one that we see, but also hydra and sea anemones. Hydra and sea anemones are both animals. So some animals can asexually reproduce through budding. Then you have vegetative propagation. So of course, because it's vegetative, that's going to be plants. So what happens is a little plant branches off. It's called a runner, and a new plant grows from it. Or you could take a cutting or a piece of the plant that can be rooted to form a new plant. Basically, my grandfather used to do this, and my mom did it too a lot. You would take a little cutting off of the plant, and then that plant would then grow roots and become a new plant of its own. Strawberries can do this, tulips, certain grasses. If you have centipede, we have some centipede grass in our yard, and it does this. Potatoes and other tubers, they have the little, if you've ever seen a potato with the, they have the eye in it, and then eventually the plant will come out of it. So that is vegetative propagation. Regeneration, you've probably heard of this before. This is where certain animals, and they're usually very simple animals, they regrow a body part. Okay, so they can regrow a body part. So if, like a starfish breaks off a piece of its leg, for example, then it could possibly regrow that leg. Another example is fragmentation. With fragmentation, it can actually grow into a second new organism. Sponges are one of the simplest animals, and they can reproduce through fragmentation. Starfish can also reproduce sometimes during fragmentation, possibly. And then planaria is a big example of them. Planaria is a protist, and they're microscopic, but you can cut the planaria every which way, every way you can imagine, and it pretty much will still grow into a new planaria. So it's really cool. So if you look here, we have a picture of our starfish regenerating some broken legs. My family goes to Sanibel Island, Florida, every year pretty much. It's known as the seashell capital of the world. There's lots of coral reefs down in that area. And anyway, there's lots and lots of shells. There's so many shells on the beach, you have to wear shoes on the beach. But it's really cool because when the tide goes out, you can go out shelling. It's actually usually one of the busiest times because so many people are looking for shells. We see tons of sand dollars, but also starfish in addition to clams and other things. But anyway, most of the starfish that you see are missing one or two appendages, one or two legs. Anyway, so there is your regeneration in the starfish. It's growing its legs back. And then on the right, you'll see the planaria. Okay, so this is demonstrating that if you cut the planaria, then this piece will grow into a new planaria. This piece can grow into a new planaria, and this piece can grow into a new planaria. You can even cut it this way, and it will still grow. Alternation of generations is another example of asexual and sexual reproduction. Alternation of generations basically means that it alternates between reproducing sexually and asexually. This is going to be, this example specifically is in plants. And what happens is the plant is going to reproduce asexually normally, but if the conditions are not favorable, so maybe the plant's not getting enough water, then it will reproduce sexually. So if you ever see a picture where you see both diploid and haploid, okay, because diploid would be asexual and haploid would be sexual, then that's probably going to be alternation of generations. Okay, and then if you see here, you got an egg and a sperm. So this one down here would be sexual. And then so here, egg and sperm come together. They made a new plant, right? They made the zygote. Well, then that zygote can then develop asexually. So this is just showing you how it can do both. So alternation generation has two phases. The gametophyte stage. So gametes, of course, are going to be sex cells. So that's going to be sexual. And then it has the sporophyte stage, which is going to be asexual. So again, advantages of asexual reproduction, they can produce a much larger number of offspring very quickly. Like I said, bacteria can reproduce 1 million in 7 hours. So it's very fast. It also increases chance of survival in a favorable and a good environment. And it only requires one parent. You don't have to look for another parent. Disadvantage would be that they're clones. What kills one will kill them all. So that makes them more susceptible to death. For example, Clorox wipes are known to kill 99.9% of bacteria and viruses for that matter. But we're talking about living things, so we're not going to talk about viruses. But anyway, bacteria are going to be killed by it. And that 99.9% is pretty much going to account for the person using the Clorox wipe. Maybe they didn't use it correctly, or maybe they missed a spot, or maybe they have a resistant bacteria, because that could happen, although it's not likely because the mechanism of how Clorox wipes work and how different cleaning products work. Anyway, so another disadvantage of asexual reproduction is that they're more susceptible to death. So that means in a changing environment or an unfavorable environment, they're less likely to survive. Because again, what kills one will kill them all. So that brings us to sexual reproduction, which is the majority of the notes that we're going to be going over for this section. With sexual reproduction, there has to be two parents. Each has to give a sex cell or a gamete. So sperm and egg, for example. Sexual reproduction is going to usually occur through meiosis. Meiosis is the production of sex cells, your sperm and egg. So, as you recall, we've talked about before that gametes are your sex cells. That is your sperm and egg. They are haploid. They come together to produce the zygote, which is diploid. Okay? And then that zygote develops into a baby. Now, this is not just animals. This could be plants, too. Because we have mentioned that, like, pollen is sperm for plants. And the inside of a flower, for example, would be like the egg. So, not just animals sexually reproduce. Anyway, so during meiosis, the chromosomes are paired up, and they exchange genetic material before they separate. So what that means is they cross over. So they exchange their DNA before they separate. So like in my body, before I make an egg, crossing over will occur. And my DNA from my two parents, because I got my DNA from my mom and dad, are going to cross over. And so what's going to end up happening is I might end up with an egg that has more DNA from my dad or more from my mom, or about 50-50. It just depends on how it crosses over. It could happen in so many different ways, and this is why two people can have 30 kids and they're all genetically different, because crossing over is going to happen differently every single time you make an egg or every time you make a sperm. So there's countless ways to combine genetics, basically. So personally, my dad, for example, it's said that I look exactly like my dad's mom. So, it would be easy to assume that when crossing over occurred in my dad's body, that I got more of my grandmother's genes and less of my grandfather's genes, because I look like her. Anyway, so because of this, your sex cells each have the same number of chromosomes, but they have a different combination of chromosomes and genes. So when the sperm and egg come together, you're going to get all these different genetic combinations from those parents. So it's very, very imperative that you know that this last statement, sexual reproduction, allows for recombination of genetic information. So it combines once during meiosis, when the egg or sperm is made, and then it combines again during fertilization, when the egg and sperm come together. So sexual reproduction has advantages and disadvantages as well, and they're basically the opposite of asexual. So a disadvantage of asexual reproduction was they produce genetically identical clones. Well, sexual produces genetically different organisms, or also we might say genetically variant or variation organisms. And what that means is that what kills one will not kill everything. Okay, so I might die from a heart attack, and you might die from cancer, and then someone else might die from a car accident, and someone else might die from a different type of cancer. Someone else might die from a stroke. We all kind of have different things that we're more susceptible to. So being genetically different allows us to adapt and survive in different environments. So we don't necessarily have to have a favorable environment to adapt and survive. Disadvantage of sexual reproduction is we produce a small number of offspring very slow. We get one baby in 9-10 months. And of course it requires two parents, so that means you have to search for a mate. Think about polar bears. They are usually pretty independent, and they gotta really look for someone to find a mate. Conjugation is another type of sexual reproduction. So the only types of sexual reproduction we're going to talk about is conjugation and meiosis. So conjugation is going to usually occur in bacteria. So this is when two bacteria exchange genetic material, usually just by touching. So they don't make offspring. It's one major difference. But because when they touch each other, because they swap genetic information, they get new combinations of genes that can then be passed on to any future offspring they have. So this is going to be unicellular things, and like I said, mostly bacteria. This is one way that bacteria can change. So maybe the antibiotic you had before for your strep throat bacteria, maybe it doesn't work this time. And that's because the bacteria could have conjugated with another bacteria to alter the DNA just enough to make that antibiotic not work. So this is bacterial conjugation. So the bacteria are touching and swapping DNA. So that brings us to the other type of sexual reproduction. So pretty much if it's not meiosis or conjugation, then it's asexual. So meiosis is a type of cell division, because you're dividing the cells and you're producing haploid cells. This is only going to happen in your sex cells. Okay, so this is that's going to be your gametes. So this is in a male and a female. So when your sperm and egg come together at fertilization, you have the right number of chromosomes for the baby. So, this is essential to continue the species. So basically, gamete formation is meiosis. Okay, so you take one diploid cell and you're going to make 4 haploid cells. Okay, so that is a major difference comparing mitosis and meiosis. Anyway, so the cells produced are going to be half the normal number of chromosomes. Okay, so in humans, that means they're going to have 23. They're going to be haploid. Now, another major difference between meiosis and mitosis is there are 2 divisions in meiosis. So it goes through PMAT twice. Okay, so it'll divide once, and then it'll divide again. In order for humans to have a normal number of chromosomes, sex cells must be, okay, so what are sex cells? Hopefully you picked haploid, which is half, because half in the egg plus half in the sperm makes the baby with a normal number. What is the primary purpose of meiosis? Okay, well hopefully you know that it's to produce gametes, and gametes are supposed to be haploid, not diploid. Somatic cells are never haploid, gametes are never diploid. Unlike mitosis, meiosis only occurs in, hopefully you know that's your reproductive cells, the sperm and egg. Okay, so this is showing a picture of like a summary of meiosis. Okay, so if you take a look here, you have your original cell, and it goes through, so your diploid cell, notice the 2N, and it goes through interphase. Notice the DNA then doubles. And if you look here, it crosses over. Do you see how this chromosome has yellow and purple? This one has yellow and purple, and this one has each. This set has each, and then so they split after meiosis 1. They split. Okay, so that's the first division. Okay, and again, notice the chromosomes. They have a little from each parent, and then it's going to split again. So that will be the second division. So if you notice, you end up with 4 haploid sex cells. Look back here, the chromosomes are all the same color. But then after prophase 1 of meiosis 1, it crossed over. And so then you end up in the sperm or egg, maybe with a little more from one parent or grandparent. What structures carry the most genetic information for a leaf cell? Hopefully you remembered this question from before. And it is chromosomes, because those are where your genetic information is stored. Okay, so that brings us to male versus female meiosis. Okay, so males and females are different. We know this. And they're different in the number of cells that they produce. Now, one thing that happens in both is going to be prophase 1, which is the first step of meiosis, and that is crossing over, where that genetic information is swapped. This makes you produce genetically different eggs or genetically different sperm. Okay, so anyway, the meiosis is a cell division where one diploid makes 4 haploid sex cells. Okay, and so they will have half the number of chromosomes compared to your somatic cells, your body cells. So essentially, the chromosome number is going to be reduced by half when you make your gametes, because 2 halves make the whole. So there are 2 divisions, again, you need to know that, in meiosis, but because you're making more cells, your chromosomes are only doubled 1 time. So, again, you start with 1 diploid and you end with 4 haploid cells. So this is just a review of some terms. A somatic cell is a body cell, okay? So anything other than a sperm or egg. An autosome is a chromosome, okay? That's not a sex chromosome. Remember, you have 22 pairs of autosomes in your body cells. So you would have 22 in your sex cells, 22 pairs in your body cells. Your sex chromosomes, those determine your sex, if you're a boy or girl. And so XX, you have one pair, so 2 or 2, depending on if you're a boy or girl. So XX female, XY male. Ova is the female sex cell, and sperm is the male sex cell. They are both made through meiosis. Fertilization is when the egg and sperm come together. So it's a union of the egg and sperm, and that will form the zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg. Okay, so it is diploid, and it is the result of fertilization after the egg and sperm come together. Gametogenesis is the making of gametes. So gametogenesis is another name for meiosis, and this happens in the gonads. So the gonads are those organs in your body that produce the egg and sperm, and it's different for a boy versus a girl, because we know boys and girls have different parts. So anyway, if you look here, we have a somatic cell here on the bottom. Then we have your sex chromosomes. Okay, in particular, these are your X and Y. I know this because it's labeled, and also because they look different. And then you have an egg and sperm trying to join through fertilization, and then you have a zygote, the first of a new organism. Okay, so unlike body cells or somatic cells, which are diploid, they have 46 chromosomes. Your sex cells have 23. That is haploid. So 23 plus 23 gives us a diploid zygote. So you got your half plus your half gives you your whole zygote. So if your sex cell had a diploid number, and then another sex cell had a diploid number, fertilization wouldn't give you the right number of chromosomes. You would have 92, and that is not viable, so it would not survive, okay? Even organisms that have 2 extra chromosomes, and sometimes even 1 extra chromosome, they don't survive. There are certain diseases that occur that have an extra chromosome, like Down syndrome, that can survive that extra chromosome, but many others do not survive. It depends on what chromosome it is. That's just having 1 extra chromosome, not having double of all of them. That is not able to survive. So that would result in probably a miscarriage maybe even before you knew you were pregnant. Anyway, so egg and sperm production, or meiosis, is going to happen in the reproductive organs. Specifically, in females, it'll happen in the ovaries, and in males, it'll happen in the testes. Any other organs that are in the reproductive system, for males and females, they're going to do different things. They're not going to necessarily make egg and sperm, but they might help the egg and sperm come together or find each other. Or even like the uterus in females, it would be where a baby is going to grow. So anyway, gametes, again, are the egg in females, which may also be called the ova or ovum. Ovum is singular, ova is plural, or sperm in males. When the sperm and egg come together, that's called fertilization. And then that produces your zygote, which is the fertilized egg. So normally humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And remember, saying 23 pair, that's like saying 23 times 2. So that's 46 chromosomes normally. And 1 pair are sex chromosomes, XX or XY. Sexual reproduction in plants depends on sex cells being produced by the process of. Well, hopefully you know that sex cells are only going to be made through meiosis. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that male and female reproductive processes were a little bit different. So now we're going to talk about how. So, oogenesis or oogenesis is the formation of eggs in females or ova. So again, this is going to occur in the ovaries. Okay, now one major difference is that it only makes one viable egg cell, and then the other three are called polar bodies. So in meiosis, one diploid cell produces four haploid cells. Okay, but in oogenesis, only one of those can actually develop into an egg. And this is because the actual egg versus the polar bodies will be much larger than the polar bodies because it's going to have more cytoplasmic materials, more organelles, more stored food, because it has to drop from the ovary down through the fallopian tubes, and then it has to, if it's fertilized, then it has to implant into the uterus, and that takes several days for that to occur. And so the egg has to have lots of like food reserves and lots of things in it to keep that egg alive during its migration, during its movement from being released in the ovary to being actually implanted into the uterus. And this is one of the reasons why it would take a few weeks to find out if you're pregnant or not, because that takes time for all this to happen. It doesn't just happen immediately. So, a primary oocyte is going to have 46 chromosomes, so it's going to be diploid. And it goes through meiosis to form two cells. Each have 23 chromosomes. One of them is going to get most of the cytoplasm. That's the secondary oocyte. The other is a polar body. And so the polar body will be disintegrated, basically. It gets absorbed back into your body. And so nothing actually happens to it. So that secondary oocyte begins meiosis too, and then it stops. Okay, so at the point that it stops, you've got to go through ovulation, and so that would be a specific time of the month where the egg is released from the ovary. So then once you ovulate, then the egg is released from the ovary, and then it goes into the fallopian tubes. So I'm going to draw a very crude drawing here. So like here would be your ovaries, and here would be your fallopian tubes, and here would be the uterus. Okay, so that would be where the baby is formed. So here's the ovary, so the egg will be released here, and then it has to travel to the uterus. That makes sense? So anyway, somewhere along its journey in the fallopian tubes is usually where fertilization would occur. And then it still has to continue traveling to the uterus, and then it has to implant into the uterine wall. So again, that takes time. Anyway, so after the egg, the ovum, goes into the fallopian tube, and then it's fertilized, then it finishes meiosis too. Okay, so after that, you get your other polar body, and then that's discarded. It's absorbed. So you get a mature diploid cell after fertilization, and that is going to become the new baby. So then, sperm, they're pretty simple. You have one diploid cell that makes 4 haploid sperm. Okay, so this is going to happen in the testes in males, and they're all viable. Viable means that they could produce a baby. They're also all going to be equal in size, which is different compared to eggs. So they start with what's called an immature sperm cell, and they end with 4 haploid spermatozoas. Now in plants, I mentioned earlier that plants can be sexually reproducing, and that is when pollen fertilizes the egg. After the pollen fertilizes the egg, then you have a seed. Okay, so the seed is kind of like the zygote. And then the seed can then grow into a new plant. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive organ in the flower to the female reproductive organ in the flower. And like I say flower because a lot of flowers are sexually reproducing. So if you take a look here, we have some differences between oogenesis and spermatogenesis. So if you look, spermatogenesis, you can see all 4 sperm are about the same. They might have different genetic content, but they look about the same. But then over here, notice the egg is actually much larger than the polar bodies. Now, I want to say this. In meiosis 1, okay, your primary oocyte might, it's going to become the egg, right? Okay, so this one over here, it may or may not divide again. Okay, this first polar body, it may or may not divide to form 2. So you might only get your egg and then 2 polar bodies, or you can get your egg and 3, depending on if this guy right here divides again.